Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this video and actually a series of videos or a couple of videos that I found to be very particularly interesting. And for those of you that did not end up seeing that of the Tim Tszyu versus Sebastian Fundora card yesterday, you of course know that it was a very decent card. I don't think that the card was necessarily worthy of a $70 pay-per-view price, but it is what it is. I still thought that it was a very decent card with some very good fights on there, including the Cesar Martinez versus that one Venezuelan fighter, Araceli Lara, who of course has been one of my favorite fighters within the past decade. Unfortunately, I believe that, his career or the best points in his career are kind of a little bit more behind him, just in my personal view. And then, of course, there was the great Tim Tszyu versus Sebastian Fundora fight. And, of course, the ass whooping that Mr. Isaac Pitbull Cruz was able to lay on that of Rolando Romero, which is pretty much exactly what I predicted. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this video and this subject is because, whenever it comes to the sport of boxing, or really just sports in general, there's always a conversation, there's always debates constantly. And unfortunately, a lot of the times when it comes into certain debates like that, a lot of propaganda or a lot of narrative can get twisted in. So much to the point to where when someone actually says something of constructive criticism in that category, a lot of people don't really know the difference between constructive criticism and that of and that of hating. They don't really know the difference. But the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because no matter what sport that you jump into, there's always going to be a conversation about who is the number one pound for pound guy within that sport. Who is the number one pound for pound fighter? Who's the best quarterback in football? Who's the best all around basketball player? Who is the most overrated? Who is the most underrated? If you were to ask me about, particular sports, if you were to ask me about who, in my view, is the most overrated NFL player at the current moment in time, I would say that, well, I guess it really depends. But in terms of a little bit of the overrated side, I would say debatably maybe that of a Lamar Jackson or maybe that overall of a Josh Allen, just in terms of the quarterbacks, just because they can never seem to quite get it done overall as what the expectations are laid out for them. If you were to talk about basketball and if you were to talk about who do I believe is potentially the more overrated player or one of the more overrated players within that of the NBA, I would say maybe debatably Joel Embiid, because Joel Embiid, even though he's a fantastic talent, and in my view, clearly one of the top 10 to top 6 players within the league, he's a guy that can never get past the second round of the playoffs. And even Damian Lillard was able to make one Western Conference Finals appearance, and other guys were able to at least make one Eastern Conference Finals appearance. So why can't Joel Embiid get there? Well, if you were to talk about that of boxing, and in my personal view, who do I believe is the most overrated fighter or the most overrated boxer on that of the planet, at least when you talk about where he's put within a certain amount of rankings for the results that he has, I would have to say that of Gervonta Davis. And I know that a lot of people, they would heavily disagree with me. And some people would state, why would you say that? You're just hating on Gervonta Davis, all sort of stuff. Well, first we kind of have to qualify about what does overrated mean. And what does, hating and constructive criticism really mean? Well, the thing is about overrated is that first, when you call someone overrated or someone that doesn't really deserve to be within that ranking, you have to qualify that of evidence overall to really state your case. Because if you state something along the lines of, say, for example, if we're talking about Michael Jordan or Tom Brady or, say, Novak Djokovic, like a lot of people, what they'll try to do to state that they're overrated is that Tom Brady's overrated. He's really not that great of a quarterback. He's a complete system quarterback. If it weren't for Bill Belichick, and all this sort of stuff, he would have never won those rings. And that might partially be true. But at the end of the day, Tom Brady was still able to win 6 Super Bowls with the Patriots and then a ring with that of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Bruce Arians, a guy who had never won a championship or an NFL Super Bowl or a ring as that of the head coach. Never. So it just is what it is. That's what Tom Brady was able to do. On top of that, he's also a 3-time MVP and about a 14 to 15-time Pro Bowler. If we were talking about Michael Jordan and we were stating that overall, well, he's a great player, but he's not really the greatest of all time because he played nothing but plumbers and bums in that 90s era, which of course is not true, but that's especially a narrative that a lot of the LeBron James fans love to push. But when it comes to that of boxing, it depends overall on what you state, because I can tell overall when someone is putting a narrative out there that I believe overall in what they're saying, or I believe that they believe in what they're stating, because there's actually some constructive viewpoints or logical viewpoints to it. And I can tell when someone is just purely hating on a person. Like when these Dante's Boxing Nations and these Boxing Egos and these guys, when they claim about Canelo Alvarez and state, oh, Canelo, he was never the #1 pound for pound fighter because he never improved as a fighter. He was just avoiding all these slick black fighters and avoiding all, the elite fighters, blah, blah, blah. Well, even they don't truly believe that, because once upon a time, Canelo was allegedly avoiding that of Caleb Plant. He was going to avoid Billy Joe Saunders. He was going to avoid this guy and that guy. And Canelo wasn't even going to dare to touch the 175-pound weight classes. And Canelo did all of that. And you can state whatever you want to about Canelo Alvarez, but at the end of the day, Canelo Alvarez has fought, the list goes on and on. Saunders, Caleb Plant, Smith, Cotto, Kovalev, Araceli Lara, Gennady Triple G Golovkin, Danny Jacobs, Austin Trout, Araceli Lara, Jamel Charlo, and the list goes on and on and on. And a lot of those guys were pretty much A-grade level fighters when Canelo Alvarez fought them, if not the majority of them at the best point in their career. Now once again, we have to dictate what is a narrative, once again, that seems to be going a little bit too far, and what then qualifies someone into being overrated. Because just because someone says something that you don't like or may not want to have that happen doesn't necessarily mean that that fighter or that particular athlete is overrated. Like if someone were to state overall about that of Canelo Alvarez, that I believe that Canelo Alvarez is the greatest Mexican fighter of all time, well, that wouldn't really make Canelo Alvarez overrated, because Canelo Alvarez is debatably the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. When you talk about the amount of weight classes that he's won in 4 weight classes. He's only ever lost 2 fights in his career. He's been completely unified in a weight class. And according to certain statistics, Canelo Alvarez is the greatest defensive Mexican fighter of all time. That's according to the stats, not even overall just off of the eye test. And then, of course, Canelo Alvarez is 5'7" with a 71-inch arm reach and beating guys at times that are 5'11" or over 6 foot. So once again, Canelo Alvarez is a dude to where you could clearly debate that. Now, if we were gonna argue about Canelo that he clearly is the greatest fighter of all time and it's not even close, then that's a point overall to where you can say, okay, you know what, that's maybe overrating him a little bit. Because, once again, when someone is starting to get overrated, you have to qualify that. And when we talk about Gervonta Tank Davis, even for the exceptional talent that he is, Gervonta Tank Davis, I would have to state, probably is the most overrated fighter and all of that of boxing today. And it isn't because he's not an exceptional talent. It isn't because he's not a decently great fighter. It isn't because I don't believe that he has the potential to be a top 5 pound for pound or even the #1 pound for pound fighter in all the sport. But overrated comes in when you're ranked above of what you've actually accomplished. It just is what it is. And Gervonta Tank Davis being ranked on the top 10 pound for pound list at the current moment in time, and even on some people's top 5 pound for pound, in my view, if you have a logical sound mind, unless you're just ranking it off of talent, you can't really put Gervonta Tank Davis within your top 5 pound for pound list. In my personal view, you really can't even put him within your top 10. That's just my personal view. But he's definitely not a top 5 pound for pound fighter. And what you'll notice about these LDBC and new media channels, and it's not just these guys, it's really just sports fans in general. What many people like to do is that with their favorite fighters, their favorite athletes, they'll give them the benefit of the doubt, or they'll give them the best standards. They'll treat them with kid gloves. And then when it comes to other fighters or other athletes that they don't want to be on that same level, they don't have the same level of standards. They don't have the same level of energy. All right. That's why when Canelo was fighting Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant, 2 guys that formerly they stated that Canelo Alvarez was afraid to fight, and 2 guys that were looked at as A-grade level fighters, when he finally fought them, all they stated was that he just faced a couple of European white boys with no power, who eventually were going to tire out. But then Gervonta Tank Davis fights these guys like Isaac Pitbull Cruz and Rolando Romero, 2 guys that were never champions at the 135-pound weight class. And no, I don't count that regular or interim championship bullshit. That's not a real belt. All right, it is what it is. All right, but once again, Al Heyman, I think, did some genius matchmaking here, because now I think because he realizes that Gervonta Tank Davis's resume, it's a bit weak when it comes down to it. Now, if anyone questions Gervonta Tank Davis's resume, he can say, oh, we'll take a look. Both Isaac Pitbull Cruz and Rolando Romero, they were both champions. So Gervonta Tank Davis has fought and beat legitimate champions. Now overall he can kind of keep the public aside with that, and his fan base can. But the truth is that Rolando Romero and Isaac Pitbull Cruz, especially Rolando Romero, those are not real championship level A-grade fighters. They're just not. Rolando Romero is definitely not an A-grade level fighter. He has some of the worst boxing ability I've ever seen in my life. And when it comes to Isaac Pitbull Cruz, he's a good little fighter, but he's a fighter that, once again, is very one-dimensional in his attacks. And I think that whenever he fights someone that is going to be a multi-dimensional fighter and a great multi-dimensional fighter, he's always mainly going to lose because he really doesn't have much else than overall coming forward, deflecting your attacks off of his arms and off of his elbows and, off of his gloves, and then coming at you with hooks. He really has no other plan of attack. That's really about it. It is what it is. So we'll see what happens, when he starts facing some of these more elite guys. But Dante's Boxing Nation, what you're going to notice is that, in order to protect that of Gervonta Davis's resume, he's going to try to make, Isaac Pitbull Cruz now all of a sudden seem like one of the best fighters in all of boxing today. But anyways, let's get into it. Let's see what Dante's Boxing Nation has to state.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So Isaac Pitbull Cruz, he puts on a great performance, completely dominating Rolly Romero, stopping him in the 8th round. It was a complete one-sided fight. Now, some people would look at Isaac Cruz and just think that he's an aggressive fighter, but he's not. He's actually one of the best defensive fighters in the game today. He's one of the best counterpunchers, hands down. Isaac, he seldom...
Isn't it very interesting that Dante's Boxing Nation, that about Isaac Pitbull Cruz, he states these things about how he's one of the best defensive fighters in the game today and how he's one of the best counterpunchers. Now, who has Isaac Pitbull Cruz really fought overall to claim that he's completely all around one of the best defensive fighters in all of boxing today, and on top of that, one of the best counterpunchers? But then when it comes to Canelo Alvarez, he's very overrated, and on top of that, Canelo Alvarez, he's a guy that is just a good Mexican fighter. He's completely hyped up. All this sort of bullshit. Once again, you can tell that Dante does not believe in a lot of the shit that he says, but he has a narrative and propaganda to play out. So it is what it is. Now, being said about Isaac Pitbull Cruz, he definitely is a good little defensive fighter. He's a guy that comes forward. His hands are always up. They're either right on his chin or up by his face. Now, sometimes that high guard can kind of blind you, but Isaac Pitbull Cruz is just not really, other than Gervonta Davis, he's just not really fought any fighters that are truly going to challenge that level of fighting. He's going to have to fight a person, once again, that can fight somewhat multi-dimensional. And in terms of, other than Gervonta Davis, he hasn't fought any other fighters like that. It just is what it is, And he, of course, gave Gervonta Davis hell, but he ended up coming short in that fight. So it is what it is. But anyways, when it comes down to it, like I said, all of a sudden Dante is going to try to sit here and tell you that Isaac Pitbull Cruz is one of the best all-around fighters in boxing today. He's a good little fighter, but in my view, is he anywhere above B+? No. He's not. But, it is what it is. Isaac Pitbull Cruz, like I said, he's a good little fighter, but he's also a very one-dimensional fighter. He can't fight in any other way other than coming forward and basically whopping you with hooks. That's all he has. He doesn't have any other plan of attack. Now, he's very good at what he does, but once again, it's just very interesting because, whenever certain fighters that they don't like, when they start fighting fighters, once again, they prop up non-black fighters, the LDBC and new media. They like to prop up non-black fighters like this for one of two reasons. Because they believe overall that they can use their name to tear down another name that they need to, like when they used Teofimo Lopez's name to tear down Lomachenko, or when they used, that Beterbiev or Bivol to tear down Canelo or David Benavidez, and then of course there's other examples as well. Or B, because they know that fighter, that they're not clearly the best within a multitude of weight classes, and that if they fight an elite black fighter, overall that is near that weight class, that they're going to get curb stomped against that black fighter, and they can state, wow, take a look at this top 5 pound per pound win that our favorite black fighter ended up getting. Now, if you state anything that he's a top 5 pound per pound fighter, you obviously have a racist issue. That's basically, what they're going to claim. And that was their plan with Josh Taylor, especially moving up to welterweight if he was going to fight either Crawford or Spence. So they could state, wow, take a look at that. They fought Josh Taylor, who was clearly top 5 pound per pound at the time, and then overall, they beat either Errol Spence or Terrence Crawford right after that. So once again, it's not even debatable. They're clearly the number 1 pound per pound fighter. And if you disagree, then you're a racist and all sort of shit. That's pretty much what they were planning to do. So once again, when it comes to non-black fighters and you notice that they start supporting them, it's only for one of two reasons. It's always for one or two of those reasons. But whenever it comes to fighters that are looked at of the best of a multitude of weight classes, they always have to tear those guys down profusely. Vasily Lomachenko, Gennady Golovkin, Canelo Alvarez, Tyson Fury, Naoya Inoue, Alexander Usyk. There's never any positive things about those fighters. And in the top 5 pound for pound, it's very hard for them to put them there. And if you were to debate overall, once again, some of those guys as the #1 pound for pound fighter, they would say that's disrespectful. And, clearly overall, there's a racial issue, all this sort of bullshit. Even though all those fighters that I just named, or at least some of them, like Usyk and Fury and Canelo, at least at the very least, you could debate any one of those fighters as the #1 pound for pound fighter, especially Canelo and Usyk. Now, Fury, it's a little bit tougher because sometimes he's inconsistent with his performances. And on top of that, he's only been in one weight class. So it's a bit harder to debate for him. But you notice once again that when it comes to certain fighters like that, that's when all of a sudden, they start to tear them down a little bit more. That's why they got their panties in such a twist about Naoya Inoue being fighter of the year. And they stated that this is laughable and that this is disrespectful, blah, blah, blah. And now they're starting overall once again. And there was a multitude of comments stating that this is why Naoya Inoue is now going to get hate, just like Lomachenko did, because they're overhyping him. So basically what are they stating? That, because he got voted fighter of the year and because it didn't fit with my pro-black agenda, I'm now going to show my bitterness and my biasness and my, true machinations overall to tear down these fighters that are non-black. That's basically overall what they're stating. Now, once again, with certain fighters, that might be the case. Like if we were to talk about last year and state that, Canelo deserved fighter of the year last year for fighting John Ryder and Jamel Charlo, that's something overall that you can claim is an injustice. That's something to where you can state there's no way that that should have happened. Not for beating John Ryder and then Jamel Charlo, overall fighter that had to move up a little bit in weight. And on top of that, a fighter that really, in my view, was borderline top 10 pound for pound anyway. Never really there on my list. That's something that would have been an injustice. But to state overall once again that, Inoue didn't deserve it. Well, at the end of the day, you can debate that Crawford or Haney deserved it if you want to. That's a great argument. But to state that Inoue just didn't deserve it and that overall it was a complete injustice, that doesn't make any sense unless you have a true racial agenda. Because Inoue fought the most amount of champions out of all those guys. Now you can debate the quality of champions if you want to. But Stephen Coolboy Fulton was even top 5 to top 10 pound for pound on these guys' list. Remember that? Because they didn't think that Inoue was going to get through Stephen Fulton. They were ranking Stephen Fulton within the top 5 to top 10 pound for pound. And as soon as Fulton was going to get, that win over Inoue, what were they stating? That Fulton hands down is going to have to be top 5 pound for pound. And then what happens? Inoue completely thrashes Stephen Coolboy Fulton. All right. And they barely put him within their top 5 pound for pound. All right. So it is what it is. So you can tell overall that they did not think that Inoue was going to get through that dude. All right. So now they have to try to tear down Inoue incrementally. And I told people this a while ago that they were going to get on Inoue eventually as soon as he was looked at as a major threat. And now the time has come.
Ever gets hit clean.
And like I said, Inoue was just as dominant as anyone last year. He fought the most amount of fighters within that past 12 months, won the most amount of belts, and was unified in 2 separate weight divisions within that past 12 months, and beat a guy that all those guys allegedly were stating was top 5 to top 10 pound for pound in Stephen Coolboy Fulton. And they had a problem with Inoue getting fighter of the year. Even though Terrence Bud Crawford only fought 2 fighters that year, and one of those fighters, of course, was a great win. You could debate the best win of the year. But then he fought David Avanesian, who was like, what, a C-minus level fighter? Like, come on, And then Devin Haney, I mean, you could debate it, but Lomachenko at that time really was not even a champion. So once again, they'll use certain points overall to their advantage, but then when it comes to, other fighters, getting, that same level of gratitude, that are non-black fighters, and all of a sudden they have to try to tear them down as much as possible.
Especially when he steps up in competition. He comes in with the high guard and his chin down, and he waits for you to throw a punch so he can counter. And he was very successful at doing this, hitting Rolly Romero with every punch in the book. Isaac Cruz winning this fight was the best case scenario, because if Romero would have won this fight, he would have just held the belts hostage.
Well, I think it's also the best case scenario because Rolly Romero is not a real champion. He's not a guy that is a real championship level boxer. But like I said, this is pretty much genius matchmaking from Al Heyman because he knew that there was going to be a little bit of pressure on Gervonta Davis stating, why are you not fighting elite level caliber fighters? Because the jig is up pretty much on Gervonta Davis. And I know a lot of people are going to state, why are you saying that? He fought Mario Barrios and Cruz and all these guys. Those guys are not real A-grade level fighters. But Al Heyman realizes over, once again, and I've already stated this, when Ryan Garcia is clearly the biggest win in your career, there's a problem. All right, there's a problem. But we're going to talk about that in the next video as well. But like I said, when it comes down to it, Al Heyman knew that his resume was looking a little bit light, but right now they have to hitch their wagon to Gervonta Tank Davis's star, because right now he's the face of their promotion. So once again, they have to make it look like his resume is a little bit better than what it actually is. So what do? They put Rolando Romero in a championship level position. They put Isaac Pitbull Cruz in a championship level position. And then, of course, Mario Barrios, all of a sudden, what? There's talks about with the vacant titles that all of a sudden, he's about to get a title shot. Is that a coincidence that all three opponents past Gervonta Tank Davis, all of a sudden they're just getting title shots? Isn't that interesting?
Held the belt hostage.
And don't get me wrong, don't get it wrong. They still put themselves somewhat in that position. But Al Heyman realized that if all three of these guys end up being a champion, that it's going to look better on Gervonta Tank Davis's resume. Because that way when people approach it and say, listen, dude, like, who are you fighting? Because these guys are not legitimate champions. Al Heyman can say, oh, well, Gervonta beat Rolando Romero, who was a champion, and Isaac Pitbull Cruz and Mario Barrios. They just all recently won belts. So, what Gervonta Tank Davis did was really impressive. But those guys are not real championship level caliber fighters. At least not in divisions that are very strong.
We all know he was never going to fight Devin.
And I already stated a multitude of times that these fighters, like, they could get a belt, if the titles are vacated or in a little weak weight class or something like that. But they're not going to win belts in a super strong weight class.
He had already turned down a Ryan Garcia fight, and he said he wouldn't even fight Teofimo Lopez. So now with him out of the picture and Isaac Pitbull Cruz is one of the champions, there's a better chance of us getting some unification bouts. And I'll tell you guys right now, outside of Devin Haney, Subriel Matias is not the most dangerous fighter at 140. Isaac Pitbull Cruz is, because of his impeccable defense.
You could certainly debate that. And Subriel Matias, he's a fighter that he's very dangerous because of the level of power and his constant barrages. But Subriel Matias, he's he's basically overall a guy that is just waiting to get exposed. He's just pretty much overall like that dirt on the floor that you haven't seen yet, but that you got to vacuum eventually. Like he's somewhat dangerous, but he's not a guy overall that the elite of the elite fighters are truly worrying about. Devin Haney ain't worrying about Subriel Matias. Teofimo Lopez ain't really worrying about Subriel Matias. The only guys that Subriel Matias is really going to threaten that much is people like Rolando Romero or Isaac Pitbull Cruz or someone like that. He's not going to beat those guys. He's just too much of a brawler. He gets hit way too often. He throws way too many punches with his overall arms and not enough overall with torque, and he can get away with that a lot of the times, but he's not going to get away with that with a fighter that truly knows how to box. It just is what it is.
Ability, because he's so short and compact. But the question is, would Isaac Cruz be willing to fight against Devin Haney? I'm guessing he will try to go after maybe Teofimo or even Matias before he goes after Devin Haney. But we'll see how it plays out. With that being said, that's all I got.
And what Dante's Boxing Nation is really stating there is that, listen, we have stock in you right now, and that we're going to promote you a little bit higher because we need to make Gervonta Tank Davis's resume look a little bit better than what it actually is. But if you don't fight Devin Haney, who's one of our guys that we're trying to push as well, we're going to turn against you, and we're going to make you look very, very bad. Because Dante and the LDBCs and new media's, what their main goal is to make sure like fighters like Canelo or Lomachenko or Usyk or guys like that or Fury, that they're not really on the pound for pound list even at all, or certainly within that top 5. That's really what they don't want. That's why, once again, they give so much more extra credit to certain black fighters that they like Devin Haney or Gervonta Tank Davis or some of these guys. But then when it comes to Canelo or some of these other guys, even against fighters that once upon a time they said would beat them, or fighters that are top 5 or top 10 pound for pound, they don't get as much credit because, once again, that's what their goal is. They can't have Canelo or Fury or, some of these guys as debatably all in the top 5. They can't have that because what they want to make it look like is that every single one of the top 10 pound for pound fighters on the earth is a black fighter, especially a black American fighter. And if it's like that, cool. But at the end of the day, when you talk about the top 10 pound for pound list right now, and this is where we also have to talk about Gervonta Tank Davis. Where is Gervonta Tank Davis really on the top 10 pound for pound list? Where does he really have room? Because I know that a certain amount of people are going to come after me and say, oh, you're wrong. Gervonta Tank Davis is a top 10 pound for pound fighter. Well, let's go over this really quickly. Because is he over Terrence Bud Crawford? We can't have him over Crawford because Crawford, and he doesn't even have the deepest of resumes either, but he definitely has a better resume than that of Gervonta Tank Davis. He's been unified in 2 weight classes. He's a 3-weight division champion. He's gotten at least a couple of A-grade wins and got the biggest win of last year with that of Errol Spence Jr., so he can't be over Terrence Bud Crawford. Is he over that of Canelo Alvarez? He can't be over Canelo because Canelo Alvarez has done more in his career. He's still unified in a weight class, and he still faces some decent A-grade level fighters here and there, so he can't be over Canelo. You know, when it comes down to it, is he over that of Alexander Usyk? He can't be over Alexander Usyk. Usyk is a legitimate 2-weight division champion. He's beaten Anthony Joshua, who at one time I had within my top 10 pound for pound, and then he unified a division in that of the cruiserweight division, which wasn't, you know, lacking as much talent as what people overall were trying to state. It actually wasn't that bad of a division, and Usyk has pretty much been debatably the most dominant fighter within the past several years, and on top of that, extremely skilled. So he can't be over Alexander Usyk. You know, is he over that of, you know, who else am I thinking of here? Is he over that of a Tyson Fury? In my view, he wouldn't be. I know a lot of people, once again, have gotten after me because they're stating that Fury, in my view, doesn't deserve to be top 10. Listen, Fury, at the end of the day, is undefeated. On top of that, he defeated a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter at one point in time in Vladimir Klitschko when he had all the belts. And then he was able to beat Wilder, who, in my view, would have been top 20. And he was dominant over them to the point to where he embarrassed them. So he can't be over Tyson Fury. You know, so then we get into the conversation overall against that of other fighters. Is he over Devin Haney? Well, he can't be over Devin Haney because Devin Haney has a better resume, and on top of that, he's a legit 2-weight division champion. He can't be over Devin Haney. Is he over that of Dimitri Bivol? I doubt it, because Dimitri Bivol has beaten Canelo, Gilberto Zeta Ramirez, and some other fighters, and he has a belt. Can he be over Artur Can't be over Artur He has a better resume for his weight class than what Gervonta Tank Davis does. And on top of that, he's right around as more dominant than Gervonta Tank Davis. So he can't be over Artur Is he over Shakur Stevenson? Can't be over him, in my view. Shakur's a legit 3-weight division champion. And he probably even, debatably, has a bigger win in his career than what Gervonta Tank Davis does in Oscar Valdez. You know, so I don't think he can be over him. You know, and then there's a couple of other fighters that I'm probably not even thinking about. But that's what I'm saying. Gervonta Tank Davis, even though he's a very decently great talent, you know, there's only so much that I can give you for the talent that you show me. I have to see results. Because what are the biggest wins in Gervonta Tank Davis's career that really puts him within that top 10 pound per pound range? Is it Jose Pedraza? Is it, you know, Leo Santa Cruz? You know, is it Hector Garcia? You know, is it that of, you know, Ryan Garcia? Like, none of these guys, I'm sorry, none of these guys are definitive A-grade level fighters. They're just not. And then, of course, I get certain guys in my comment section saying that, you know, oh, well, Gervonta Tank Davis beat Gamboa. Gamboa was done, dude. Like, these are the same guys that claim that Canelo fights these guys at their weakest, you know, and Canelo fights washed-up guys. Dude, Gamboa was done ever since Terrence Bud Crawford had knocked him out. Like, to bring up your Yorkis Gamboa as a win over Gervonta Tank Davis, you know, when it comes down to it, or you know, for Gervonta Tank Davis to win against Gamboa, like, why would you even bring up that point? Like, that's just embarrassing. But it is what it is. But anyways, let's get into the next video. Let's see what Boxing Ego has to say. Okay, so this is going to be the second part of this video, where Boxing Ego, of course, he ends up having a problem with the recent ESPN rankings of the 135-pound weight class. Which, of course, ever since that both Teofimo Lopez and Devin Haney, ever since that they were out of that weight class, Lomachenko now has been ranked number 1. And, of course, Boxing Ego did not like this, you know, allegedly because Vasily Lomachenko was coming off of a loss and all sort of stuff. All that is a bunch of bullshit. You know, like I stated, you know, Boxing Ego, and the reason why these guys have a problem with this is because they just don't want someone like a Vasily Lomachenko looked at as the number 1 guy of that weight class. And on top of that, they have to put a lot of stock in that of Gervonta Tank Davis. All right, now don't get it wrong. If you want to maybe state that Lomachenko right now is not the number 1 guy, that's up to you. But if we're also going to be real about Mr. Gervonta Tank Davis here, Gervonta has not accomplished enough in that division to at least be definitively number 1 in that weight class. You know, but Boxing Ego once again. But, you know, this is also why I wanted to do this video, because a lot of these LDBC and new media channels, unfortunately, because, you know, their demographic, and a big part of the reason why they have such a big following is because it's the victimization mentality, especially within that of a lot of minority groups, within that of the westernized cultures. You know, it's very overall, you know, big. when it comes down to it. That's why it's so easy overall to appease to a certain amount of these guys, because they have the exact same thought process. And, it's very unfortunate. But when it comes down to it, you have to be very careful, because a lot of these times, these guys, they'll try to basically trick you. And I'm mainly talking to a lot of minorities here who probably will want to watch this video. They'll try to pull at your heartstrings, and they'll say, oh, can you believe that Lomachenko, is ranked #1 within that weight class, and he's 17-3 and overall this sort of stuff, and Gervonta Davis is 29-0. Can you believe this? That's the same shit that they were trying to pull when Lomachenko was starting to be debated as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter, and they were like, oh, well, how can he be #1 when he only has about 13 fights? Listen, at the end of the day, it's not, and listen, I understand if we're talking about a guy that hasn't fought repeated champion after champion after champion. Lomachenko became a 3-weight division champion, I believe, within about 13 fights. All right? He became a 3-weight division champion, I believe, within about 13 to 15 fights. All right? That's what Lomachenko did. And people can state whatever they want to about Vasily Lomachenko. And if you want to state that in certain regards that, maybe if he was a little bit overhyped, I would understand it to a certain degree, because, with him being put up there with Mayweather and other all-time great fighters, at least of that level, if he is on that level, one could certainly state that he should have beat Teofimo Lopez and that of Devin Haney. Of course, a lot of people would state that he did defeat Devin Haney. In my view, it was a fight that could have went either way. But when we talk about this conversation about Lomachenko being the #1 guy, I don't really have a problem with it, because logically, in my view, it makes sense. And we're going to go over why. But anyways, once again, you have to be very careful, because these channels, especially if you're a minority, especially if you're that of a, black person and watching these channels, they'll try to really pull at your heartstrings overall and try to suck you into that victimization mentality. And don't get it wrong, some of the points that they bring up are valid. Some of the points overall, when they talk about double standards against black fighters, they are valid. But this is not one of those cases, and I'm going to explain why. But let's get into it. Let's see what they have to say.
ESPN does it again. They have Lomachenko somehow.
Now, what BoxingEggo, I believe, is stating here, and I'm not sure if he's referring to Vasily Lomachenko, maybe at one time erasing that one loss, which in my view also was a bit sketchy. But I believe what he's actually referring to is possibly when Canelo Alvarez was rated as the #1 168-pounder of all time. Now, would I personally agree with that? No, I wouldn't. But it's very interesting, because BoxingEggo, the only one that he really cared about getting disrespected in that video was that of Andre SOG Ward, who, of course, was, a black fighter overall of, the 2010s. I mean, of course, his father was actually a Caucasian, but but when it comes down to it, overall, Andre Ward, of course, because of his look, he's pretty much, what a lot of people will call a black fighter. But as when it comes down to it, BoxingEggo, the only one that he cared about being disrespected was black fighters on that list. But then when it came to Joe Calzaghe, who accomplished great things in that weight class as well, had a great amount of title defenses and all that other stuff, all of a sudden he didn't care about it. And he pretty much left Joe Calzaghe in the dust. Once again, I keep telling people that these channels, that they're not meant to be logical and objective. They're meant to be the victimization pro-black cult, which is very representative of the victimization, mentality of a lot of those demographics in America. It just is what it is. All right, that's who BoxingEggo, Dante's Boxing Nation, that's who they represent. And that's why it's so hard for them to admit, even when certain fighters like a Canelo Alvarez or a Naoya Inoue or a Tyson Fury, when they're the real deal, because they can't have that, because in their mind they're very insecure overall with their placement in the world. It just is what it is. They look at themselves as somewhat, a little bit invalid or a little bit too much of a victim. And that's why you can never fully trust what these guys say, because when you take a look at it from too much of a victimization lens, and you're always going to be taking a look at something from a bitter point of view. And when you take a look at it from a bitter point of view, you're not going to take a look at it from an honest and objective line. You're going to be looking to try to tear down things, overall, whether it be objective or non-objective. So that's what a lot of these guys do.
Some way.
And don't get it wrong, just because you state something that might be a little bit derogatory or something that is looked to be, not politically correct, that doesn't necessarily mean overall that you're not telling the truth or that you're not bringing up a very good point. For example, if we were to state about Vasily Lomachenko real quick, even if people may disagree, that, you know what, I thought that he was a little bit overhyped because of the way that people were talking about him, comparing him to Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao. And I didn't think that he deserved that level of praise yet. And it turned out that he ended up losing to Teofimo Lopez and also that of Devin Haney. That's somewhat of a fair point. But to bring up a point overall about this and then claim that, oh, he's ranked number one because he has the complexion for the protection. Everyone knows that Vasily Lomachenko at one point in time was almost completely unified in that weight class. And when we talk about Shakur Stevenson and Gervonta Davis, they've had very few effective fights there. In fact, Shakur's only had one effective fight there. So it is what it is. And Gervonta, we'll get into his resume in a minute.
Coveted number one spot, as you guys see. ESPN put up this graphic on their card last night. ESPN's lightweight top 10 at 135 pounds. Somehow, in some mother-ucking way, they got Lomachenko, who is 17-3. 17-3. 3 losses.
Right, and the LDBC and new media has been bringing up this stupid-ass point for the longest time, which really carries no weight. They kept trying to bring this up when Lomachenko was debated as the number one pound-for-pound fighter. And they were like, oh, you can't have him as the number one pound-for-pound fighter. It's Terrence Crawford because, overall, he's 12-1 and all sort of stuff. Listen, if you're talking about Lomachenko being debated as the number one pound-for-pound, like when he had just defeated Rocky Martinez, then I get it. But when Lomachenko, at least when I debated him as the number one pound-for-pound fighter, and rightfully so, that was when he defeated Jorge Linares. And you must understand that at that time, Lomachenko was running through guys, and not only was he running through guys that were looked at as just basic fighters or, bums, but he was beating guys like Nicholas Walters. He was beating guys like Gary Russell Jr. He was beating guys like Guillermo Rigondeaux. Remember how the LDBC and new media wanted that fight for so long? And they said that Lomachenko was avoiding Guillermo Rigondeaux, and then that fight happened, and they said what? Oh, well, Loma fought him after a year layoff. He was way too big anyway. That's why I'm saying, like, these guys, they talk all this shit about how Canelo needs to fight Terrence Bud Crawford. They won't give Canelo no damn credit for Terrence Bud Crawford. They didn't give him credit over the middleweight Jermell Charlo. And Jermell Charlo, believe it or not, was bigger than Canelo in that fight when it came down to it, at least to a certain degree. So then they're not giving Canelo no damn credit for Terrence Crawford. And then Canelo sees right through that bullshit. He's like, why the fuck would I want to fight Terrence Bud Crawford right now? I end up losing to him overall. It's going to be debatably the most embarrassing loss overall, of a guy, moving up in weight, or fighting a smaller guy. And then on top of that, if I beat him, I'm not going to get any credit anyway. And then on top of that, it's not going to be as much of a major payday as what I can make over some other fighters. Like, why would I want to fight that guy? There's no reason to right now.
Should be 4, because I thought he lost to Jermaine Ortiz for sure. Yet and still, ESPN has him as number 1, which to me is very laughable. You guys see?
No, it's not very laughable at all. When you talk about Gervonta Davis, what fights has he really had there? His last 4 or 5 fights, let's take a look at them real quick. His last fight was against Ryan Garcia. Ryan Garcia was not campaigning there when he ended up defeating him. All right, it is what it is. His fight before that was against Hector Garcia, who was not even a 135-pounder. He was a 130-pound champion who Gervonta Davis ended up bringing up. And isn't that very interesting? They always mention that Canelo brings up these fighters one weight class, but then when Gervonta Davis did it over Hector Garcia, there was never any mention of it. Isn't that very particularly interesting? And then, of course, you have that, of Isaac Pitbull Cruz, who was one of the top contenders there, but he wasn't top 5. He ended up being Rolly Romero as well, who was another bum-ass regular champion, but not really one of the top guys. At the end of the day, it's not really that hard to figure out why Lomachenko's the number 1 guy. He's won more belts than any of the other guys here. Now, if you want to argue something that, well, I don't think Lomachenko should be number 1 there because at the current moment in time he doesn't have a belt and he's coming off of a loss, that's somewhat of a valid point. But to say something overall along the lines of, oh, this is laughable to have him number 1, Lomachenko, whether you want to admit it or not, out of any of the fighters there currently, he has the best resume at that weight class. So it is what it is.
Gervonta Davis is in at number 2. Now, keep in mind, Gervonta Davis had a belt, a secondary belt, got elevated, so he's a full champion. Meanwhile, if you look at Lomachenko, he's actually coming off of a loss. His very last fight to Devin Haney was a unanimous decision loss. So a guy with no belt coming off a loss in 2024, somehow, some way, they have him above Gervonta Davis. And
That's somewhat of a better point, but here's the problem. Gervonta Davis really never ended up beating any of the champions there. So that's the problem. So I understand what Ego is trying to say, but when you talk about, oh, it's laughable, well, no, not necessarily, because, you know, when it comes down to it, you know, you can maybe state, like, in the heavyweight division, for example, like, if someone ended up winning a belt overall because it was vacant, like, you know, like, let's say that, you know, overall Zhang ended up winning a belt, because it was vacant, but AJ Anthony Joshua, you know, didn't have one of the belts. Would you put Zhang over AJ Anthony Joshua? I mean, it's up to you. But, you know, and now I understand Mr. Ego's point, but at the end of the day, I don't really have a problem with Lomachenko being ranked number 1 in this once again, because he has the best resume out of any of the fighters, even in this weight class.
Shakur Stevenson, explain how this is supposed to work. After that, they have William Zepeda, which I really don't understand. Like, he's good. He's a good little fighter, but I don't understand what he's done. They have George.
Agree, he's a good little fighter, but he's not great. Thank you for stating that, Ego. Keep that same energy if Gervonta Davis picks him next with all these stiff-ass Latino fighters.
Boses, and then you see Isaac Cruz at 6, Frank Martin at number 7. And, I mean, here's another thing. They got Frank Martin at number 7, and we know he's about to fight Gervonta Davis, so that's probably a reason why they didn't have him in the top 5. But Frank Martin in at number 7.
Well, you could debate that, but Frank Martin also has never won a belt in his career. You know, so once again, here's the point, Mr. Boxing Ego. If we're going to go, you know, because here's the thing, Boxing Ego in this video is already telling you a little bit of his bias, because he doesn't know whether to go off of boxing talent or overall off of boxing accomplishments. And when you talk about boxing accomplishments, no one has accomplished more in that weight class within the past few years than that of Vasily Lomachenko, at least out of any of these fighters on the list, unless your name is Devin Haney or Teofimo Lopez. All right, so it is what it is.
He fought Artem Harutyunyan and beat him, and ESPN fighter Shakur Stevenson is in at number 3, and this is ESPN's lightweight. So this is not, oh, what you've done in your career. This should be like what you've done in the division. I mean, how do you get ranked in the...
So let me ask you something, Mr. Boxing Ego. What has Gervonta Davis really done in the weight class? What has he done? Because the only 2 fighters that he's really defeated there of note has been Rolando Romero, who is a regular champion, not even a legitimate champion, and Isaac Pitbull Cruz, who I don't even believe was a regular champion there. Like, so it is what it is. Say whatever you want about Lomachenko, but Lomachenko has at least won a multitude of legitimate belts in that weight class.
Like, so let's say Usyk moved up from cruiserweight. Very good fighter, just like Shakur Stevenson, an Olympian like Shakur Stevenson. So if Usyk moves to cruiserweight and he's supposed to fight Tyrone Sprong and he had some kind of drug test fail, so they bring in Chaz Tablespoon, does Lomachenko buddy Usyk, would you rate him at heavyweight in the top 3 when his only performance is that Chaz Tablespoon fight? That don't make sense. You know, because you're in a brand new division. Yes, you're a quality fighter. Yes, you were previously undisputed. Now, for Shakur Stevenson, unlike Usyk, he hasn't been undisputed in any of his divisions. Like, I don't even know if he's unified. He's only had 1 belt at best. And his last performance, most people believe to be his worst performance.
It was his worst performance. It was a terrible performance by that of Shakur Stevenson. Now, he still won. But in my view, he did not look very good in that fight at all.
Versus Edwin De Los Santos. So Shakur just got here, and this is not a knock on Shakur. I'm just being real. Shakur just got to this division. He literally just got here. He fought some Japanese dude, Yoshino, who was unknown in America, was not perceived as...
And once again, you notice that he's complaining a little bit that Shakur Stevenson is over Gervonta Davis. So not only is he majorly pissed off that Vasily Lomachenko is number 1, but he's pissed off that Gervonta Davis is not looked at as the number 1 dude. But at the end of the day, it's like, listen, at the end of the day, Gervonta Davis, his fights there really just don't have that much weight. Like, no one gives a fuck about that Rolando Romero win, bro. Like, Rolando Romero is a nobody. It is what it is. And then on top of that, Isaac Pitbull Cruz, you know, I mean, he's a good little fighter, but he's not great. You know, so Lomachenko has accomplished the most amount. Now, if you want to state, well, I still don't think Lomachenko should be number 1 because he doesn't even have a belt there. That's fair. That's something overall that you could debate. But once again, to say that this is completely based off of complexion, well, no, you can say that it's based off of because Lomachenko, at least within the past few years, that he has the most amount of results there out of any current fighter. Period.
A top guy or a top threat. And he has a Frank Martin.
Now, could it be racially motivated to a certain degree? Yeah, it certainly could be. But to state overall something along the lines of, oh, it's laughable. No, sir, it's just that you really don't have any idea what you're talking about.
Negotiations that leads nowhere. And then he has the Edwin De Los Santos fight. And some people even say Edwin De Los Santos won or nobody won, or overall it was a bad fight for both, right? So I'm not understanding these rankings. Now back to Lomachenko. You guys let me know how Lomachenko, with 20 fights, and he has 3, should be 4 losses, is...
And you notice how he keeps rephrasing overall there should be 4 losses. Like I said, Boxing Ego and these guys, they always love to mention this shit about how certain non-black fighters always get these robbery victories. But then when it comes to their favorite black fighters, then the same energy is not applied. Like when he says, when he talks about Jamel Charlo, he'll never say that, oh, well, Jamel Charlo has 2 losses, should be 3 because of the Brian Castano fight. Or when he talks about Wilder, oh, well, 3 losses, should be 4 because the first fight was a robbery against, Tyson Fury. When it came to, like, he doesn't say anything like that. That's how you know, once again, a lot of these guys, they're racially motivated.
Three should be 4 losses is up there higher than the likes of Gervonta Davis, right? Who's 29-0, all but 2 people, including Isaac Pitbull Cruz, who fights tonight.
Right, but dude, no one gives a fuck about his 29-0 record because he hasn't fought anybody. Once again, people can keep going on this bullshit all they want to about how, Lomachenko is 17-3. Lomachenko's 17-3 record pretty much bulldozes over Gervonta Davis's 29-0 record. Now, if we're comparing Lomachenko's record to maybe like that of a Devin Haney, or something like that, then it's a little bit more understandable, or maybe a Teofimo Lopez. Because they've defeated some decent fighters. But Gervonta Davis has literally defeated nobodies. It is what it is. And, people can get pissed off at that all they want to. When the best wins of your career, when the best win of your career is over Ryan Garcia, there's a problem.
All but 2 people, including Isaac Pitbull Cruz, who fights tonight, have been knocked out by the man. I mean, somebody got to make sense. In the words of Tupac Shakur, somebody got to explain why I ain't got...
But anyways, that's pretty much overall about it for today. I just thought that was very particularly interesting. But Gervonta Davis, even though he's a very exceptional talent and a great fighter, well, a great talent, I should say, because in my view, to be a great fighter, you have to actually face other great fighters. So we'll see what ends up happening. So it is what it is. But I just thought that I would talk about that. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.